Hello, good morning. As we know, in the program we have the pleasure to have here the President of Portuguese television channel, RTP, Mr. Alberto da Ponte. He will share with us the strategy of RTP, not only for Portugal, but to the other Portuguese communities in the world. So please, and thanks very much to come here.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Professor, for this very kind invitation, and good morning, everybody. Just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Alberto da Ponte, and I am presently the president of RTP. RTP is actually Radio Televisão de Portugal, which in itself is already an old-fashioned way of calling, because it should be called something like Radio, Television and Web Portugal. Actually, we are not anymore the public service of audiovisual, but we are the public service of media. And media is something very different than just television and radio nowadays, as we all know. What I will try to give you is a brief perspective of what we do, and what our mandates are in terms of really serving the media, the public service of media. A brief history, I don't know if everybody is aware, but for the last, until January this year, for 18 months, there was a big discussion in Portuguese society about the privatization or no privatization of RTP. Finally, on the 24th of January, the government decided that it would not be privatized. So it will remain a company with an only shareholder, and that is the Portuguese state. However, the Portuguese state, Portugal as a country, is going through huge difficulties, as we all know. So one of the things that we cannot say we have plenty, or rather, we have very little, is money. And therefore, the government decided that the contribution to the public service would be severely reduced. So first of all, how do we finance ourselves? We have a thing called the contribution for the audiovisual. In the case of Portugal, each home pays per month 2.35 euros. Which gives more or less an average of 1.15 per Portuguese, and that is all we will have, together with the income from commercial activity, which I will explain. But let me tell you first that we are the country, the last but one country in Europe with in terms of contribution of the state, or in this case of the citizens, to finance the public service. The last one is Albania. So we are now facing a situation where I will give you the numbers, we will come from a budget, from an income of 250 million this year, to an estimated income of 185. 145 comes from this contribution of the Portuguese in what I told you is the contribution for an RTP, and the other 40 will come from commercial income. What is commercial income? We are allowed to have in our channel number 1, RTP1, 6 minutes of television, which compares with 12 minutes allowed to the commercial channels. And we have some other incomes coming from all kinds of things, new products, the income that comes from cable TV, where we sell contents. So we have, first of all, a problem of trying to adapt our size to the new situation. And we built a program which we call the Program of Development and Right Sizing of RTP. And this is the strategic program we have now, and we are trying to put strategy into action, basically. First of all, we are ruled in 4 instances, and these are the Constitution of the Portuguese Republic, which basically says that in his article is in number 5 of its article 38, that the state must ensure the existence and the normal work of a public service of radio and television. That's constitutional. Then we have a law which is called the Law of Television and Radio, where the concept of public service is briefly described, and as well as the enablers for its delivery. Then we have RTP is a concessionaire. So the state gives us RTP as a concessionaire. By the way, this concession, in theory, will end by 2019, right? And then we have specific agreements, because you will see that we are not only, we have not only the duty of being universal, but we have the duty of being as broad as to hit all the segments in the Portuguese society. So, the first thing that we have in this program is 7 what we call dogmas, principles. And 6 of them are actually inspired, or better saying, even translated from the mandates of the European Public Service. Namely, in EBU, what they say is that our fundamental values are universality, independence, excellence, diversity, innovation, and responsibility. These are 6. We have added a 7th, which we called global Portugality. You never heard this word Portugality, and the Portuguese equivalent, Portugalidade, does not exist either, but it's something that we have created, and people are more and more talking of Portugality as a word meaning everything that has to do with our with our diaspora, so to say, and the expansion of the Portuguese language and the Portuguese culture all over the world. But it's more than that nowadays. It's actually basically the binding agent of Portugality is the Portuguese language. The Portuguese language is spoken by 260 million people. After the, just to give you an example, Spanish is spoken by 400 and English by 400 and plus million people. So we have really a presence in terms of language where we believe that we have a responsibility, and this responsibility, I will explain you briefly, is in our plan. We have established, and I will talk to you very briefly about that, a strategy based on a vision, a mission, 6 strategic objectives, and 9 values. Before I explain the strategy, let me say that I believe in 2 things. The world today can be described as a world under VUCA. VUCA is an acronym, VUCA, which was invented by the American military, first to accommodate the scenario of war. It was afterwards copied by the governments, and it is now assimilated by management. And VUCA means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This in itself determines a different way of making a plan. And so what we must have is a plan that sets clear directions, but that must at the same time accommodate flexibility. The new entrepreneurs, they work under also another couple of words, a virtuous circle that I can describe as being act, learn, and build. Act, learn, build. Act, so you must not waste time considering detailed plans. You must act quickly, learn quickly, and build on your own learnings quickly. So we have all these directions, but we are willing, we must really be flexible, agile. Just to give you a description of our vision, we will be the pin of all the Portuguese. We want to be the public service, the dearest or the most appreciated and beloved service of all the Portuguese and friends of Portugal all over the world. So actually, if you are a friend of Portugal, I will fail if you don't wear the pin of RTP here, right? So that's actually what I'm trying to do, is also to sell a little bit. As I often say, if I want something to buy something, the best thing I gotta do is sell, right? We know that. Then we have a mission which is to be the principal means of development in terms of social, cultural, and economics, through information, entertainment, and formation, learning, teaching with quality, and do that in a sustainable way. Sustainable. The word sustainability is associated to one thing, vital, innovation. You cannot develop an organization if you are not innovative, exactly because the world is under VUCA, right? So the 6 strategic objectives is, one is to be the best SPM in Europe in the ratio quality-cost. The second determines a level of audiences that we must have by 2015, 22% in TV and 9% in radio. We must be the recognized pioneers in innovation already in 2013, so we want to be ahead of whatever is our competition in terms of innovation. We must live with whatever the state or the Portuguese citizens want to give us, but we must be, what we are saying here, we must be independent of the state budget, which does not mean that we will not fight for other types of income. So this program, and I mention this because it's often regarded in the Portuguese society as a restructuring plan, which is not. It is a development plan, basically. Fifth, we want to be the best team in the Portuguese media. being a team, working in a way that is not working by silos, working laterally and transversally, working in network is absolutely fundamental for the team to develop its mission. And we want to be the television, the radio, and the net mostly seen, heard, and read by the Portuguese community and Portuguese and descendants of Portuguese in all the world. And this is exactly a point that I will now stress or underline a little bit, which is what we want to do, which are our obligations in terms of public service. Let me tell you that although we belong to this small country, we have a very complex mission. Number of channels in TV. We have RTP1, which is the what we call the generalist channel. And that's the one that is allowed to have 6 minutes per hour of advertising. We have RTP2, which is defined as a channel directed to the different segments, where we broadcast for religious minorities, you know, sports that are not widespread. I mean, we may as well, you know, broadcast badminton match in RTP2. And I'm sure badminton is not exactly the most, you know, seen sport in the world, but some people like it, and we must do that. Then we have RTP Madeira. We have RTP Azores. That's in, you know, that's in free-to-air. We have RTP Africa, which is for all the countries in Africa that are Portuguese-speaking, so to say Angola, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe, Cabo Verde, and Guinea. And we have, of course, still the channels in radio, in cables. Sorry, we have RTP Information and RTP Memoria, where we make use of a very rich thing that we have, which is our archive. We have images since 1957. So that is really, really a wealth that we have, and we, I believe, must make better use of it. But so as you see, and of course in radio is more or less the same thing. We have three radio stations in Portugal. We have one in Madeira, one in Azores. We have Radio Africa. We have Radio International. I forgot to say, besides RTP Africa, we have RTP International with two different missions. RTP Africa for the African countries that speak Portuguese. RTP International, the target are all the Portuguese that live abroad. In Portugal, we have about 10.5 million inhabitants, but abroad, we have another 5 million living abroad, right? And more are going. There is, you know, a second wave of immigration in Portugal due to the crisis and to the unemployment, which is now around 18% in Portugal. So, if we look at the plan, we have, this plan is then translated into 4 axes, which we have called the winning axis, in order to be able to accomplish the strategy, which are growth of income, total innovation, right sizing, and organizational transformation. We must change the organization totally, because we work very much by silos. And an organization that works by silos cannot be a successful organization. If people don't talk to each other in a systematic way and are not motivated by the result of a team, then the company loses. Let me talk a little bit about our strategy for the, which is included exactly in growth of our income, but is also, as I told you, a mandate of our public service. We have a strategy for the international service of RTP, which is what we call basically what I described to you as RTP Africa and RTP International. And we have four clear points of mission there. We have to promote the external image of Portugal. We have to promote the Portuguese, or to help promote the Portuguese language. We have to give a platform of identification and unity for all the Portuguese in the world and for all the communities that are Portuguese speaking. And we have to contribute for the satisfaction of national interests, namely in the cultural, economic, and entrepreneurial domains. As we say, we have to have as well, to accomplish that, all the values plus one, which is good taste. Good taste is important. And it's much more of a responsibility than one might think, because if I broadcast a program which says, for instance, that Portugal is likely to get out of the Eurozone, immediately our banks suffer a decline in the remittance of immigrants all over the world. So we can, if we don't do things right, it's not obviously to say that we should, hinder information, but it must really be a point. It must really be a must, if I'm allowed to say that, to promote whatever is good in Portugal. And believe me, we are a southern country, but we have certain qualities that don't show up, but we really do. In total innovation, there was, one of the things that is written in the plan that is an ample debate in the Portuguese society because it sounds bizarre. We said we must absolutely have a technological partner. And then you can understand that after 18 months of talking about privatization, when we write in the plan we must absolutely look for a technological partner, the first belief of some people is to say, well, they are looking for a partner in a hidden way. But that's not the case. Why do we have the absolute need to have a technological partner? Because we don't have the means, only by ourselves, to go at the speed of technological innovation in the media area. So we have established that we must look for partnerships in three lines: software services online, distribution and telecommunications, another area, and solutions and equipment, which is the other area. This by itself says that we are not looking for one single technological partner. Everyone that can be a technological partner can be associated. And that we say, okay, but in a partnership, you receive something, and what do we give? We give contents of extremely high quality in Portuguese language. We give know-how in some vital areas. And so this can even lead us to help some of the small and medium enterprises in Portugal that are dedicated to the new technologies to join forces with us and then together with us go even for other geographies like Africa, like Europe, like the world, because we should not forget what I said before, that we have the ways and means to hit citizens and consumers in all the part of the world. Having said this, these are the main, the plan is has got exactly 30, a little bit of suspense, 36 pages. For those who have read the plan, I have now even a contest, that is, the record of this contest is that the winner so far is the one that has managed to stay awake until the 19th page. So if you have the chance to read the program, and if you read the 20th page, I have a prize for you, right? Okay. But the main thing remains, as everything in life, that we have a problem in terms of transformation as well. And transformation is very simple. We need to change the culture of the company. The company works by silos, and the main thing in terms of transformation is to create a culture of working together. Working together. That's absolutely fundamental. And of course, I must not hide the fact that we have to reduce costs, and we are reducing costs in two main areas. One, in external services that we buy. So we are trying to negotiate better, to plan better, but unfortunately we don't see how we can survive with the number of people we have now in the company. And that's the beta part of the program, but that's a part that must be followed and will be followed. So, this is our challenge. If I want to describe it in a way, I will be satisfied, really satisfied, when I see a Portuguese, either living in Portugal or living abroad. And if he is wearing a pin in his lapel, or her lapel, then I will be the happiest man, because it means that my RTP was finally successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an amazing description of RTP strategy. If you are available, maybe we can open 10 minutes to questions.
Of course, gladly.
If you have
Gladly,
questions.
gladly.
Yes.
I am interested to know which are your relations with the Brazilian television.
Very good question. Very good question. The answer that I'm going to give is not the one that I would like to give. We have some difficulties in the penetration in Brazil, mainly because one of our commercial competitors has got for a long time an association with TV Global, that is SIC, which is a very important, belongs to an important group in Portugal called Imprensa. But I believe that we should, there is the national, public service of media in Brazil. Pedro, remind me the name. TV Brazil. With whom we are trying to establish relations. They have a very low score of audience, of course. They were born in 2007, Actually, they copied some of our. By the way, it's another thing. To copy with pride is also a very important thing. To be humble, to be able to copy the good practices. So they inspired a little bit in our public service. They have a different way of working. They are much more, government rules than we are. We are very, very independent, and it's one of the things that we must keep. But it's an absolute must to penetrate in Brazil. Now, we have two ways of doing, in my point of view, either with alliances with another broadcaster, or to go through broadband, right? So we can use the web to penetrate in Brazil. It's the most difficult country for us of a Portuguese-speaking country, for us to hit. Amongst other things, because it's very funny, but if you have, for instance, a series or a film in Portuguese spoken in Portugal, and if you broadcast it in Brazil, normally you have to have subtitles, right? Because the accent is so much different. It's not the same thing the other way around, because since 1977 that the Brazilians have exported to Portugal the soap operas, right? So you have very successful soap operas that are Brazilian. We ourselves broadcast Brazilian soap operas, which is quite normal. By the way, we are the first country outside Angola that is now broadcasting the first Angolan soap opera. So it shows our dedication to the Portuguese language in a way, but it's very difficult. So I'm afraid to say that our work with Brazil, or our cooperation with Brazil, is very embryonic, so to say, but it must be developed.
Your goal is to...
Sorry, ladies should be first.
I didn't say sorry.
Here.
I didn't say sorry.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, when you talked about the Portuguese content and your production, quality production, if there's any of the model that it seems the BBC faced something similar several years ago and maybe again, but they tried hard to develop other ways of marketing their content to Anglophone countries, or internationally anyway, in terms of existing content and material on the web and series. Are those options for you, or when you talk about the content that you have, how might you capitalize on that and the production expertise?
I think that what you say is an absolute must. I think BBC is an example of things that were done in the past, and as you say, things that are being relaunched by the new general manager of BBC, which now realizes the need of providing even more contents, or a quality or a more active way of expanding the contents of produced or aggregated by BBC throughout the world. And if there is a public service in Europe that we must look at, and afterwards adapt our dimension to the Portuguese realities, is BBC. BBC is, especially from that point of view, is clearly a best practice. So I intend to meet the CEO of BBC next June in Malta, where there will be a General Assembly of the European Broadcasting Union, and I intend to establish a closer relationship with BBC, and actually with all the European Broadcasting Union, because some countries, and I give you an example of the Flemish Belgian public service, that have been very successful by reinventing the way they did broadcasting in their own country. BBC is more than that. BBC is an example on the way to handle web, with a VCI player, and is an example of the way contents of extreme quality can be sold and appreciated by other people in the world. Of course, we must not hide the fact that the English language is universal and the Portuguese is not universal. But if you look at what I told you, we, in very simple numbers, we have 260 million speaking Portuguese, right? And if the content is of good quality, we can always double or subtitle the content. But to answer your question, BBC is clearly an inspiration that must be followed. Your turn, please.
My question,
Beg your pardon.
my question is close to the previous. You speak about quality, excellence, responsibility. Do you have tools to measure, to evaluate quality from the point of view of the Portuguese people?
Yeah, we do two things. One that we are doing, the other one that we are studying together with EBU. We measure the degree of satisfaction of the Portuguese citizen regularly. So we know things like if they really like and then respect brand, what they like to see more, if we are respectful of our duties that are measured, we must have an absolute amount, a certain amount of information, of cultural programs, and so on, and that we measure regularly. This question of measuring what the consumer or the citizen or the viewer or the listener, whatever, wants is very important. And very recently we discovered that due to the crisis there is a shift from the most appreciated kind of of program, so to say, that used to be information. And now the Portuguese wants light entertainment, which puts a difficulty for a public service company like ours. But light entertainment means, in my point of view, that the Portuguese is so tired of austerity measures, problems and everything, that when he gets home, all he wants is to relax. So the debate is how can we give this kind of relaxation in a way that is not utterly commercial or vividly abusive, if I may say so. I will give you an example. One of the Portuguese hits or the big programs in Portugal, as somewhere in the world, is a program called Big Brother. And right now, one of the commercial channels, TVI4, is broadcasting, showing the Big Brother VIP. So they look for celebrities, or as the Brazilian called, the celebrities that go to a Big Brother, they don't call celebrities, they call them sub-celebrities, because normally are celebrities that are unemployed, right? Because otherwise they would not have the time to go to the Big Brother. This is the kind of program that is not, we cannot broadcast a program like that. It's not in our values. So the question is how to fight and to have an audience is a very difficult nut to crack. But the only way that you can do that is exactly by doing what you asked me if we did, which is to have constant information on the aspirations, the likes, the dislikes of the Portuguese citizen. And once we have these aspirations, we can try to do two things: either to give them what they want, if they are objective enough in the way they express themselves, or try to shape them and to go for their ambitions and anxieties and deliver a new product that can go for that. So it's a very difficult... Beg your pardon.
we don't have much time to do more questions, so 2 questions, okay. John and okay.
But Professor, if you allow me, through Pedro, who will stay here more, I believe he will stay a little bit more time.
Okay.
If there are any questions, you can collect.
Okay.
And the good answer is that I will answer totally for free, in spite of all my problems of income.
Okay, John and
It's not Christian.
I'm puzzled by your strategy of Portuguese language globally.
Yeah.
As media has gone more and more vertical and people are much more interested in things that are in front of them and their own problems, the thought of being relevant to people here in Portugal and relevant to someone in rural Brazil, yes, the language may be the same, but the problems, the issues that confront that person are so very different. It seems like it's a throwback to say we have a strategy of following the language for other than nostalgia about Portugal to really be relevant to 200 or 300 million people scattered all over the world. Language is 3rd or 9th on the list, not 1st in other media's experience. How do you propose to make it 1st?
First of all, I don't think we can ever do that if we don't associate to some of the operators in these other countries. And let me give you an example. If you talked about the interior of the Brazil, and if I go to Amazonia, I believe it's very hard for them to, they will be not very interested in knowing what the Prime Minister said yesterday. By the way, I myself hope I would not have heard what he said yesterday, but that's another matter. But the question, I think, is that you have to relate to the locals in order to be able to deliver the content that that they are interested in. And the other angle is, and I will give you the example of Africa. If there is an interesting thing in Angola, for instance, that is worth the trouble and the money of documenting it for other people, then we can help doing that, and it's our mission to do that. So when I say talking to the international communities, for instance, of Portuguese, or talking to other people that speaking language, these are 2 different segments. I know what the Portuguese people living abroad are interested in. They are interested in some of the clues that they identify with in Portugal. The people in Amazonia, or in Benguela, or in Beira, Mozambique, they will be interested in other things. But I will give you an example of everything that a Portuguese or someone who speaks Portuguese is interested in, is Benfica. So if I give them Benfica, it will be all right.
Is a television channel sustainable in long run? I mean, in financial sense, or is it possible, or you have to decrease the number of channels?
I don't think we have to decrease the number of channels. Rather, the answer must be awkward, but must look or may look awkward. But I think we even have to increase the number of channels in free-to-air. Portugal is the country with the least number of channels in free-to-air. We have now 4.5. I say half because we have the parliamentary channel, which is not even a channel. So the difficulty, we must do that because this stagnation in the free-to-air television has reduced the expression of free-to-air broadcasting and has given enormous penetration to the cable TV, which is in itself awkward for the size of the country, the wealth of the country. So one of the things that is now a debate in Portugal, even within the regulatory authority in Portugal, ANACOM, is whether RTP should not take a step forward and give more options in the free-to-air. They have even suggested, I think I'm saying the right thing, that 2 channels that we have in cable should come to free-to-air. Now, it's not anything that you must put in free-to-air. You must put something that is meaningful. So what is the equity of the channel? What is the mission of the channel? So what the channel will deliver is a very important thing. And it's something that we are now studying. Another important thing that I forgot to mention, but I will mention it now because it goes straight into your question, is that one of the things in the program, and it's being developed by, it's being headed by Pedro Brauman here, is a redefinition of the service public of media according to the world we are living today. The definition that we had, which is an old one, is probably not suited for the way of living and the aspirations of the Portuguese citizen or the citizen, broadly speaking, elsewhere in the world. So we have to redefine that. And then we have to have a debate. I would not say a social debate about that, because when you put it to debate in a very ample social and not methodological-oriented way, you run the risk of having no debate at all. But we are thinking about that, and in our program we say that by September this year we must have this thing developed and accepted by the shareholder. In this case, I think it's not only the shareholder, but the Parliament that must give the acceptance. So we have an offer of 200 plus channels in cable. We have 4, so to say, in free-to-air TDT, and that's RTP1, RTP2, SIC, and TVI, and Channel 4. So, and we have the parliamentary channel, which is basically parliamentary, broadcasting. So we must have more. The problem is how to finance that, because it's costly. But we have a strange situation in Portugal as well, where the owner of TDT is at the same time the leader or the co-leader in cable TV. So it's a nut that we have to crack, and we are very much hopeful that ANACOM, the regulator in Portugal, will take a definite view on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your, especially for your patience. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We go to the next session. The topic of the next session, for all of you who don't have the program in front of you, is regional media convergence. This is our topic today. Just to give you 2 or 3 introductory remarks, what we are talking about, and especially the way we intend to talk about. What we decided is, in this session, move a little bit back to one of the old formats we had at the EIMA conference, which is basically discussion, talking about a specific, very precise concept, a very precise question, and getting involved and getting a discussion going. This is basically what we're trying to do. This was the way the first EIMA conferences, for instance, Chicago, basically have been. We didn't have any presentation, we just talked for 2 or 3 days, and it was a lot of fun. So this we're going to do today. When we decided about half a year ago about one of the topics, the topic came up, regional media convergence. Important to know, what does it mean? First, what it does not mean, we are not talking about technological convergence. The idea of moving platforms together, technologies together, and so on, this is another issue. We are also not talking about the idea of integration of services and markets and these kind of things. Also, we are not talking about consolidation of companies by alliances and by mergers, for instance. What we're talking about is the idea, when we look, for instance, at Europe in this part, are we going to get similar contents in the various countries? Are we getting similar formats? Are we getting similar programs, maybe similar or identical stations? And by the way, and I come back to this, the presentation we had before was an excellent presentation because it proved one point I think we really should discuss about, but I come later to this one. Those of you who would like to think a little bit ahead could memorize the idea how often and in which context in this presentation the term Europe was mentioned. For those of you who took notes, it was a very interesting part when did he mention the term Europe. And this was just great for me. So this was perfect. Okay, so the idea, regional-median convergence. So what we have today here, we have several countries here related, from Brazil, we have temporary here, and we have United States here in this part, and we will look a little bit in the idea what happens in these regions. So this is the topic. We start a little bit with a few minutes. We have 10 minutes left. No, we have more time, I think. So you give us a little bit extra time since we started 45 minutes late, so we have a little bit left. Okay, I talk a few moments about Europe. In my other life, I'm part of the one of the directors since 25 years of a Europe Institute in Germany, where we're basically doing European studies, trying to see why and how Europe converges or does not converge, how we get similar political systems, how we get all this legislation done, and all the other issues. And in this context, and there is a big scientific community around it which deals with something which is called European studies. And in the European studies, there is one term which is a very prominent term. This is a convergence in Europe. The idea, to which degree is Europe becoming closer to each other, similar to each other, merging into each other? So what we can see, for instance, now we have identical passports. We don't have visa regulations or the other ones. For instance, when I was 20 years ago in Saarbrücken, there was one time I even needed a visa to go from Germany to France, which was about 10 miles away from my home, so I had a visa to go to France. It's just about 20 years ago. So the times really changed. And what we do see is, and this would be a long presentation which I'm not going to give, what we do see is a certain level where we have a huge amount of convergence. In Europe we have all kinds of regulations for things which become similar. From the bananas to the gasoline to everything. Everything is ruled and becomes similar. Even the passports look similar. The plates on the car look similar. Everything looks similar. The currency is similar. I mean, to some countries even identical. So this is a most intensive way of becoming similar. What we also see is when we see the whole idea of Europe, even though on the visible level, to some degree, we have a process of convergence, there are many parts where we do not have a convergence, where we even have a divergence, which means that people in certain regions become to me more interested in their own idea. John mentioned this idea of vertical. This is something comes from a different area, but hits exactly the same point. So now they start to think, okay, what does it now mean to be coming from Austria? What does it mean to be Belgian, and so on? So now in this case, we have on one part the convergence process, and in other parts almost particularistic ideas of divergence. That's the issue which is kind of interesting. So we have these two processes, which is for European study a hot topic. Today we are not on the conference for European studies, we are on the conference on media management. And so it's interesting to see how do media relate to this specific process. And not going the whole paper, it's a long paper, who would like to have it? I have it, of course, and I can give it to you. Just focusing on TV stations and TV programs. The older ones of you can remember there was a time when there was something like a Sky program, European Superstation 82, where they tried to have one TV station for Europe. It failed totally. Then came other ideas. Then, for instance, we got MTV. This was one of the products we imported from our friends across the ocean. We started in 1987. We started with one MTV for Europe. Now we have 19 different MTV stations in Europe. And they're always becoming more separate. They get more local content, they get more local ideas, they get more local languages, and so on.
So what does it tell you?
This tells me in this particular case that we have not a convergence. In this particular case, we have a divergence, which means they start to get more local, they start to get more their local artists, and so on. The same holds true for many other ideas. I'm not going through all the list of the stations, but for instance, there is only maybe one news channel, one sports channel, which is Eurosport. This is the only one which is kind of the European one, where we have a multilingual concept, where you can choose the languages, but basically we have the same different kind of badminton all over Europe. There are only very, very few cases where programs and or even stations, but basically programs, are done across borders. There are not too many in Europe at all. Most experiments failed on a dramatical way. There are just a few examples. For instance, Arte is one example, which combines Germany and France. So you have the same program with French and German, everything fine. However, still, to some parts, they are on the time scale, they are 50 minutes apart, because both countries have to pay attention to the local time when they have the news. In Germany at 8, in France at a different time. So not even this works. There used to be another one, which is not very successful, between Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, where they had a common language. Which means the real surprising factor is that we don't have this idea of European television in this part, except of maybe ownership. This is another issue, but I'm not talking about this one. And the point is, and we had maybe our president in Germany read our program, maybe you send it to him, but Joachim Gauck made a big speech 2 months ago about Europe, about the idea, what does Europe really mean to us? And he talked about the first part of his speech, basically about the idea, why don't we get finally this idea of European television? We have this broadcasting union, but this is basically for technical standards and other parts, maybe a little bit trading programs. But we don't have a European program. Well, as a politician, he makes it easy. He says, well, why don't we just get it? Let's get it. What he didn't know is that at least 10 generations of politicians had the same speech before. Every politician says we need these kind of stations. We don't get it. The interesting reasons, why don't we get it? And the other part, and this is what we discussed maybe here, is the idea of what happens about Latin America. Do they have a convergence and divergence? And so this is what we discuss. And before I open the floor and before I open the panel to this, I like the presentation before. The idea, did you memorize when the term Europe was mentioned? Well, I wrote with me, because I know what I was looking for. We learned about the global Portugality, which is not really Europe. Let's put it this way. We had 3 points where was Europe in there. Number one, we are not talking about the exit of the Eurozone. Well, this is a very specific topic. Being number one, equality in Europe, okay, this is nice, every country wants it. And we promote what is good for Portugal. There was no statement in there, the idea that we are part of Europe, that we try to promote the idea of Europe, and so on. And the similar holds true for most of the other countries I know. Most of the TV stations, TV programs, public, private, whatsoever, basically see themselves as somebody who is really trying to promote the idea of the individual local country. That's the idea, not about Europe. Well, on the other side, there's some money in Europe. Brussels, of course, tried to do the other way around. They're spending lots of millions in the idea to getting a unified program, but it doesn't work. So the interesting aspect we might discuss is one which is basically from the empirical point of view. I'm not saying what is good or wrong. I mean, this is not a decision of a value or something. I'm not saying that is the wrong way as we have seen it. It's a wrong way of doing it. I'm not saying the right way would be the other way. However, the interesting aspect is on a purely empirical basis. What really can be observed? Do we have a convergence in the sense I was talking about, or do we have a divergence? This is a purely empirical basis. The next step would be what could be the political advice, but this is not really what we as an academic group are going to give.
All right. So we have, I think it was Robert who yesterday said we need more numbers and we need more longitudinal numbers, right? It was you? Okay, well, here we go. So we did a study, and there are a good number of people here in the room who participated in this, on 30 countries, about 80% of the world's population, on the media on the media industry structure in their various countries. They followed a common methodology that we at Columbia kind of tried to supervise and enforce. There are, I think, more than 10 or 12 or so of these countries were European countries, most of them EU countries, and we have other countries around the world, and so we kind of put this, for purposes of this presentation here, into regions, because there was the topic convergence around the world in regions. So let me see what I can show you here from the results. Now, some of the results, let me say right in advance. We heard about Europe, and there's a certain self-image of Europe, of pluralistic and competitive and open and media. I bring you bad news, those of you Europeans. The data does not support this self-image. Okay, so we have also 80% of the world by GDP. So, and these are the media that we covered, about 13 or so of them. And so, just to give you a bit of a summary numbers, and then we'll kind of drill down for some other observations. When it comes to content media defined here by the left side of that column, plus some of the search engines and so on. If we look at the content media, on the left you have the world's average, and the red column is 2008, 2009. The blue column is 4 years or 5 years earlier. We have some older numbers, but it gets complicated because not all countries have them. So those are the best comparable numbers. So you got the EU countries around world average, but higher in media concentration defined as that Herfindahl-Hirschman index that economists use for market concentration, and then weighted in average in terms of market sizes. In Europe, you have a market concentration that is markedly higher than in North America. It is somewhat higher than in Asia Pacific, but the BRICS, Latin America, and the Middle East are higher still. For the Middle East, we didn't have enough countries, so I would not take that too seriously. Now, when it comes to platform media, which are cable television, telecom, wireless telecom, mobile telecom, and ISPs, you have a declining market, declining concentration, but here too, EU is about at world average, but not above world average. And you see a fairly consistent pattern around the world, which is that Asia and Europe are at kind of similar levels for other industries too, and North America is somewhat lower, but EU countries not particularly low either.
Could you read out the x-axis once? Which country is which? Because you're sitting in front of it.
We don't see.
Just tell us which one is which.
There's the world, there's the EU, there's North America, Asia Pacific, Latin America, BRICS, and Middle East. And I'm sorry that this is the case, because that will give you a problem on virtually every one of the next slides. So now let's kind of look at news media, which are for political reasons and other reasons. Chris, maybe you can also move, and I'll move a little bit over. So if you look at news media, and within news media you weight it by the time that people spend on the news using it as news source, you will see that in terms of concentration, European countries are kind of pretty much exactly at world average. You also see that concentration is declining. Good, that's good. But you also see that both North America and Asia Pacific are lower concentrated in news media terms. Even Latin America is slightly lower. Now, moving on with some data. We define something as a power index, which goes to show for a company that has media ownership in one media industry, newspapers, but also in magazines and also in television. We are trying to establish an index that goes across media to reflect the fact that you might have a moderate market share in one market, but if you also have one in a second and a third, cumulatively, you actually have a very significant or larger market media power. And so when we do that just for content media, well, here's the numbers that you can see. And that number is increasing pretty much everywhere. So the cross-media ownership power is increasing around the world. Now, if you just do it for news media, it is declining in Europe, it is increasing in the United States, it's fairly stable in Asia Pacific. Again, North America and Asia Pacific are lower in that concentration and media power than EU countries. Now, but there's one if you do the same thing for companies, there's one company that is off the chart. That is the most powerful media company in the world, and it is not even close, and it is increasing considerably. The color, I think now we're kind of going in the opposite direction, unfortunately. It's the leftmost is the most recent one. So while search engines are not specifically a very large industry as media industries goes in aggregate terms, but the market share and the globality of one company, Google, makes it the most powerful media company off the charts. We also looked at the number of what we call voices, media voices around the world. And here you can see on a regional basis who the dominant what the numbers of media voices are around the world. And so you can see there's, roughly speaking, about 40 to 50, say, in worldwide on average in a country. Media voice defined now as a media organization in magazines, newspapers, television that have a market share of more than 1%. So it's about 40, 50 voices, which is not a bad number, but it's not a dramatic number. And it is not I would again point out to you the fact how these various regions stack up. Now, since my time is close to running out, let me address the question that is often being presented, which is, yes, but the internet is going to solve all of our problems, right? Well, there is this belief in the technology that creates opportunities, but does it actually reflect reality? The realities are that, first, that internet concentration is not low at all. Now, the myth is that every dog can be on the internet, and you can tell a dog on the internet and entry is easy. That is true, entry is easy. But in a technical sense, entry into, let's say, printing a magazine is also very easy. That doesn't mean that there are many successful newspapers or magazine companies, because there are other things, economics and market structure, that are a fact. And for internet media, if you think about it, in most industries, there are some very dominant players. There's Facebook, there's Google, there's Amazon, there's Apple. These are big players, they're globally big players, And in fact, if you take a look at this chart here, it will show you in comparison how new media and old media stack up in terms of market concentration. What you see here is old media, no, let's call it old media, and for lack of a better word, new or internet media. On the left, oldest media, kind of newspapers, books, magazines, they're kind of like traditional, in the green. In the center, in gray, 20th century media, television, radio, cable TV. And on the rightmost side, you have internet media. And what you can see fairly consistently around the world is that the newer the medium is, the more concentrated it is. And the intuition behind it is becoming more capital intensive. It is more technological. It is relatively easy to get into book publishing, magazine publishing, what have you. So we have many. But it is not so easy to get into the activities of telecom or the activities of the internet. And therefore, actually, as media becomes more technologically driven, we are seeing a more concentrated medium, and that is very consistent around the world. And so to conclude here, what I think is happening is there's another form of convergence. We're talking about the convergence of media among themselves. But if in the past we had content media that were unconcentrated and platform media that were highly concentrated, now the two are converging with each other because the content media are becoming more high fixed costs, low marginal costs. They exhibit all the characteristics of traditional platform media. And so that is the convergence that we are observing, a convergence of content media into much higher concentration levels than before, and that is something that we can see around the world.
Okay, thank you for this. Maybe just 2 or 3 questions to the data, just to understand it a little bit better. Why don't you just go back to the slide where you had these voices? This was an interesting one.
Yes.
More, media voices, this was it.
Yes.
When you have media voices by country,
Yes.
So you say you kind of look at the voices you have in the specific countries, and then you compare it. When you take the regions, are you taking the average or the sum of their voices?
We are kind of, let's say you have 6 countries in a region. We take the voices in each country,
Yeah.
and we weight them by the size of the country. The
Okay.
size of the country in population terms. So that therefore, let's say, France has a certain weight, and Italy has another weight, and France has a certain weight, Italy has another weight, and Sweden has still another weight.
This means if we have 10 very distinct voices in France and 10 very distinct voices in, let's say, Spain, or Portugal, of course, sorry, Portugal. In Portugal, you would come up with 10.
Yes.
Yes, so that's a very interesting point, because in this particular case, for instance, in the United States, if you have 10,
Yes.
the whole United States, you would also come up with the number 10.
Yes.
So in this particular case, if we have 10 totally different voices in France,
Yes.
and totally 10 different voices in Portugal,
Yes.
you would come up with the same number as you would have if you have in the United States, where you have 10.
Yeah, I know.
You see my point.
I know what, Chris, where you're going. You're kind of trying to somehow kind of create the I think, illusion that somehow Europeans consume European media rather than their own national media. But even your own earlier example of MTV shows that.
No, that's not the point. This is just dealing with the data. And this is kind of, you can take the sum and the average, and this comes, you see the same differences, and this is, I like this, this is methodology. It's the same way when you talk about media concentration.
Yes.
For instance, when you take United States, then you have ABC, NBC, maybe 2, 3, 4 other ones.
Yes.
And this maybe comes up with a lower media concentration,
Yes.
as you might have it in Europe, where you have 25 countries,
Yes.
each has its own different stations. So therefore the idea, the concept of measurement in this particular case constructs, at least to my point of view, a totally different picture.
But Chris, only the methodology your point is only valid if you say that the Italians are consuming Spanish media and the Spanish are consuming Swedish media. Otherwise, there's no point in that. One thing that we observe is that actually media are still highly national. There are obviously a few exceptions, but on the whole, media ownership is mostly national. Media consumption is mostly national. There are obviously some cross-border type situations in Switzerland and so on. There are some exceptions, but on the whole, media are fairly national. And so there's no point in saying, yeah, but we also have stations in Sweden, and therefore Portugal has these other options of media to consume.
Okay, I would leave it this way, even though I see we have some different ideas. Still the point, at least to my interpretation of the data, there is a difference whether somebody in Washington watches NBC and somebody from San Diego also watches NBC, USA, or somebody in Lisbon watches RTP and somebody in Germany ZDF.
And what's the difference?
The difference is that in one side we have basically one kind of media, one kind of TV station, which covers the whole region, and in the other case we basically have several regions with several different stations, and that's a different concept. And in this particular case, both of them would sum up in the same number in your figure. What is our empirical research from Cologne saying?
Well, I would agree with Chris.
I don't know.
Depends on what you want to see. But I mean, you're saying that you have, I don't know, a certain concentration for 320 million US or 300 million US citizens.
Yeah.
And you have them for whatever 60 million French citizens.
So what's the point still? I mean,
the point is we are not challenging the idea how you measure the concentration in the country, but the idea of taking an average across the country, and by this defining the concentration and the convergence process within a region. This is the little point at least two persons in this room are challenging currently. Okay, right. Some more questions. Yes, please.
I also agree with your point of view. With the German.
Okay, now we have three. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, I don't get it at all. Is that weighted by, for example, 1,000 people of a population in the country? Like you've got newspaper readership on average, weighted by 1,000 people, like newspaper indices are being built. I mean, doesn't the size of a country make the weighting for the media voice that we measure? Isn't that an efficient kind of measurement of doing
Chris
so?
and I say. That's what Chris and I would say, and that's not what Ellie has been measuring. We are just measuring something different. I mean, there's probably no right or wrong, so maybe you want to go on.
Yeah, so the point is exactly, there are two different things what you can measure. Yeah, and so the idea is, I'm just challenging the idea of taking the average and getting the same idea of concentration, depending on what you look about.
It's a weighted average. It's a weighted average.
No.
If I'm here in Portugal and I watch one TV station, in Portugal, because it's a national habit, I mean, to me, to have the UK TV station wouldn't mean anything more than if I was in the US. I would have another US TV station. So.
Yeah, I agree. We are measuring two different things. Still, the point is the whole United States watches an NBC, so 300 million watches the same one. In Europe, we have also 300 million people. We are separated in 30 countries, and everybody watches the same. Watches a different one.
Yes.
Watches a different one. So the point is, according to his measure, both areas are treated identically. In both ways, we have the same media power. In both ways, we have the same concentration. However, in one case, we have 30 countries, each watching their own station. And in the United States, we have one country, 300 million watching one station. And therefore, at least we both started immediately when he showed this slide and said, well, he'd taken the wrong measure. In this case, the average doesn't count, but the idea of how many people are watching how many different stations, this would count. And this is a different measure. Okay, so far to the methodology.
Boring what you're saying. There's some boring what you're saying because what you're picking on is the geographic unit that was used in the measurement. Now, in the United States, if you take your approach, you could say what are the number of stations in each of the individual states. So you've got 50 states, and you might say, because you've got local stations, television stations, for example, in the United States, then the average on that basis would actually increase along your measure. It's not the same thing. You're measuring oranges with apples here. You're comparing oranges with apples, and it's not appropriate. So if you take a region on the base that the project was done, there is a validity of comparison. But what you're suggesting, there's no validity of comparison because you say, let's divide Europe into each individual state, but let's not do that for the United States, even though it's the same nationality. Okay?
Okay, still, let's not continue with the methodology. However, we have a national television in the United States, but we do, yes, we have NBC United States.
So what's the point? What's the point?
Why don't we have a national television in Europe?
Well, because
So,
It's called public broadcast.
let me,
guys, just a second, Chris. You don't have a national television in Europe for the same reason that you don't even have a regional MTV, which is kind of music. I mean, people's interests and tastes are different, and it might be that on some ideological and elite level you're kind of talking about European culture, but actually the people in their choices of television tell you that they think differently.
let me say, just also as a participant in this study that Eli was directing and so on, that any kind of analysis covering different countries have methodological problems, because the definition of newspaper is different country by country. The definition of audience is people who are 4 years and older or 6 years and older, so you cannot clearly compare everything. But the good thing with that is that on the one hand you can follow country by country what's going on. On the other hand, you can have general trends. For instance, some of these slides shows that BRICS countries are more concentrated than the European Union. So it never gives you a very precise figure, but it gives you some clouds to understand what's going on in general trends. So my point is that it is useful, even though, every country has different concepts, measures, and so on. So the good thing is that it is useful. That's it. That's the point.
Good. I think we should move to the next presentation. Okay. We had many more questions. I think I had 5 more questions. We have to look a little bit on the time.
Well, sorry to interrupt the good discussion, but in Latin America, the Uruguayan writer Angel Rama said once that the map of Latin America is not the geographical map, because it's the map based on culture. For instance, when we are close to the borders of the Amazonian, the Peruvian, Brazilian, and Venezuelan Amazonian are all the same, but there are also 3 different countries. Well, I come from Brazil, and Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in Latin America. So you have an idea of our difficulties of exchanging and of convergence, especially in Brazil. But in convergence in Latin America, I think each country has its own culture. So it's regarding television program, it's very difficult, even though Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, they are very, very big producers, and they export their productions to other Latin American countries. But they are always write it, I would say, because the cultures are different. So even though Argentina exports a program to Colombia or Colombia to Argentina, they will be different. They won't be the same program. It's the same thing with the European programs from Endemol and all the kinds of programs that we have there. But then, I would say that in Brazil, we are closer to Portugal than to any other Latin American country. And this is cultural, and because of the language. And I would say also that if we can imagine the region, a production from the region, that would say the Telesur, and that's a political convergence. It was proposed by Hugo Chavez, and it involves 7 countries, and from Latin America and also Cuba, from the Caribbean. And this is the only convergence in television that I would say that exists in Latin America today. This is a channel called Telesur. I don't know if you heard of it or if you know of it. And but not all countries are involved in that. And also, I've been studying South American public television for the last 5 years. And there's a lot of talk, official talk, about one public television channel for Latin America. But this is only talk, because it has been said for 2 years now, and there's nothing at this moment. And so that's what I would say about South America and Latin America.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I had remarks, and then I heard what Chris said at the beginning, and I realized my remarks weren't appropriate for what this panel's about, so now I have other remarks. This is about content, not other things, so okay. Then a few points. There is, we could say, an archaeology of production and consumption, by which I mean that there is a history of making different kinds of genres, and the professionals who make, for example, news programs or situation comedies or dramas, they are familiar with the basic codes and conventions, with the way these things are done, and the management practices tend to follow those codes and conventions because over time they've been proven to be efficient. So if we watch a news program that originates in Finland, and we watch a news program that originates in the United States or in just about any other country in the world, they look fairly similar. So there's a history, there's layers of experience, and also in the terms of what audiences expect, how they think these things are supposed to look. When I was teaching at the George Washington University some years ago, I had a course in radio production, and the first assignment I gave my students who had never done any radio in their lives was to make a 30-second radio commercial. And every American student could do that with no problem, because they had heard thousands and thousands of radio commercials over their lifetimes, and they knew how it's supposed to sound. So they made it just the way it's supposed to sound. It wasn't very creative, but it sounded oftentimes remarkably similar to everything else we hear. Secondly, I think there is convergence, and it has to do a lot with the way programs and genres work and the archaeology of that experience, both at the production end and at the consumption end. Secondly, there's also an issue that has to do with market size and language, quite obviously. I was involved in the production of a book called Small Among Giants that was co-edited with Christian Niesen. And this book looks at the relations between small countries and large countries in a large number of ways, and particularly about things having to do, for example, with language and so forth. Now, what we find is that small countries have generally higher costs because they have less people available to pay for programming, and that they have less market range. It's very easy to see a program from the United States. How many of you have seen anything from Finland? Not many. And we have some pretty good shows, but you're just not going to see them very well because the pipeline tends to flow one way. It's not really a network. So you know, there are these kind of things that we also have to take into consideration, and it has an impact on management, because managers tend to look for where the models are, and very often the models they look at may be inappropriate. ZDF and ABC and ARD in Germany have a combined income of about 8 billion euros. Now they have an roughly 80 million population. They can do a heck of a lot with that much money. Finland, YLE, has about 400 million euros. They can't do nearly as much, and they got a population of 6 million. So we have to take this into consideration as well, because it means a large proportion of the content on screens in smaller countries originates in other countries. And that has profound implications for a couple of other things. One of which is the fact that people have conditioned expectations, or I would call them conditioned expectations at least. One episode of Mad Men costs about $1 million to produce. There's about 13 episodes in a season. That's $13 million to produce that one program for that one season. Plus all the development costs and all the marketing costs that are involved with it. How many programs of that kind could a small country produce? Not many. So if you're a manager thinking about, you know, what kind of programs your company's going to produce, or at least going to commission, you have to be very careful in your choices. And very often this has a problem with when we start talking about innovation, because innovation is inherently risky. More experimentations fail than succeed in science as well as business. And so companies are very reluctant in many cases to take really high risks. They would rather import something that is popular and they know audiences will like. And there is now a growing and booming trade in formats where you can take basically the structure and the concept of a program and fill it in with the local language and some local changes, and you have something that appears to be local but is actually international. And you minimize the amount of risk that you have. So it has a major impact on the development of convergence. And I would also note that it's really complicated for smaller countries because their citizens are seeing a great variety of programs from big and wealthy markets. So they're used to thinking that a good show looks like American or looks like UK. Then if you have your program without that much money or that much expertise, it looks kind of not very good. Yeah, I mean, I don't like those Finnish shows, even though I'm Finnish, you know, it's important and everything, but, you know, it doesn't look cool. It's not great. It's not slick. So then that puts an added amount of pressure, too, in order to kind of measure up to the benchmark standards that people have now become conditioned to expect. So there's no way to avoid this. I mean, we live in a kind of global environment where there's all kinds of trade in formats, in programs, in concepts, and this will continue. And I'll just conclude with kind of remarks about what's good and what's bad in a way, or what's the positives and the negatives about this in my view. And in terms of positives, I could say that actually innovation thrives on difference. You never get anything new by putting two old things together. Two old familiar things together equals a new old familiar thing. You have to have difference interacting in order to have something that's really innovative. In innovation, the new math is 1 + 1 = 3. You put together two things that haven't been together before and you come up with something new. So if you have all these influences from abroad, it's possible that something new can happen, even in your domestic market, that you can invent something, that you might create a new concept or an approach that would be really quite popular. Endemol has done rather well, and that's not a giant of a country where it originates. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that at least for a country like Finland and other smaller countries, we actually have more voices and a wider enrichment of worldviews. We not only have the Finnish view, we also have the Swedish view, the UK view, the Australian view, the Canadian view, the Spanish view. I mean, we have programs from all over the world, and people watch them, and they even learn language that way. That's enriching. It's not necessarily a negative thing. And I think a third positive is that there is still a great amount of variance and difference in what will work. Some programs or formats that have been very popular in one country, when they tried to, in a way, transport them or import them to another country, have been abysmal failures. Like The Block, that British program in the UK that everybody just seemed to love because it was about fixer-uppers, you know, taking a house and fixing it up, and it seemed to be really popular there. They tried it in Australia, and it fell flat. So it's not always the case that local tastes are going to be the same as global preferences. So these are positive things. Now, negatives, I think, first of all, as I said earlier already, it's not a pipeline. I mean, it's a pipeline, it's not a network. There's big pipes from big markets with big money and big companies into smaller ones, but it's not going very well the other way. So there's not as much circulation as maybe we might like. Secondly, it is true that the domestic production can suffer in comparison with a lot of what happens in the big markets. And this can cause unrealistic expectations also among regulators and among owners and governments who would expect, for example, a public company that doesn't have nearly the kind of money or expertise to produce stuff that's just as good as what they have in the United States. Well, this company's not going to be able to do that, at least not on everything. Maybe you can make some strategic choices, but there's going to be complications in the expectations. And finally, content is not as easy to get as sometimes we might be thinking here and implying on this panel. Increasingly, it's becoming more difficult to get access to content in other markets because of copyright restrictions that are closing down or limiting the amount of access you can get. As an expatriate living in Finland, you can believe that access to American content, particularly in news, is very important to me. I want to see what is the newscast in America, at CBS, at NBC, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But oftentimes I'm finding that I'm having problems getting access because they say, well, your computer has an address that ends with .fi, and therefore you can't have access. Okay, I can get around that. I can hire a service in the United States that makes it mask my address so that it looks like I'm from inside the USA. Yeah, well, we would. It's legal. As long as I'm paying for the service, money talks. But I'm just saying that it's not as easy to get outside of the official pipelines as you might think. It's not just free for all and easily available everywhere. Those are my remarks.
Okay, thank you. So this concludes the panel part of it. You raised a very important issue at the last portion of your presentation, the idea what is eventually good or bad at the whole discussion. And I think this is something which really goes into the, not even social responsibility, but the idea what media are supposed to do. And I really think we should stress this idea of good or bad. I think this was a very important part. The idea, is it wrong to have in Europe 30 different stations, to have these different voices? Some politicians, just to give you some information, the European Commission currently really thinks about the idea of having a model similar to the United States, where you have one or two big networks, which are easily controlled by the government at least to a certain degree, where you have one voice which you can immediately put through the whole United States, which is totally fascinating for the politicians. Currently in Europe you have another way, and therefore they think about it, because what they don't like is that they get a different perspective on the current crisis in Europe from the Greek television compared to the Austrian television and maybe to the Spanish television. So here you have the variances, and therefore the politicians like the idea, as you said, having one voice across to 300 million people that just love this idea, and so they currently hate this idea of having the variances within the countries. And so the differences idea really is something which could be important, and for us maybe something we, even though we have different concept of measuring, let's not think about the average again.
So who's controlling that one voice?
Which one? In Europe?
The one voice, yes, that you're promoting.
No, I'm not. No, I never was promoting the one voice. I never was promoting the one voice. I was just reporting the idea that in the European Commission in Brussels currently thinks about the idea of getting similar to this one voice like the United States, because it's easy to handle. You get 300 million of people moving in one direction by the media.
Okay, so who's controlling that one voice then?
We don't have it in Europe.
But who would control it according to these proposals?
They try to control it in Brussels, but fortunately it never works. And I think that's a good idea, to give my personal opinion. I like the variety. Okay, any more remarks? Yes, please.
Hi, I just wanted to complexify a little bit about everyone's statements about the television in the United States. Mm-hmm. Just because there's 3 national networks doesn't mean that those networks are the same in all the places that you watch them. In fact, every network has programming on at different times. In different time zones in the States, it's split into two. And most of the stations are carried by affiliates. Most are not O&O, owned and operated. And so they have different programs and different local programming. And the idea that there is monolithic American channels is really, really simplistic in my view. There's variation.
Okay, yes, please.
Quickly, just one question, I'll be short.
What struck me most of Ellie's presentation was the fact that he talked on chart 15 about an internet concentration index of North America being lower than that of the European Union. Whereas earlier on he said that Google was the strongest company in terms of media power, and I think that's an American company, isn't it? Can you explain that dilemma to me?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Google's market, Google is in a market that is not the only internet market. Okay, ISPs are in revenue terms significantly larger. Secondly, Google's strong position is that it is international, that it is large, but it is also large everywhere, whereas typically ISPs are mostly nationally focused. So therefore, in case of Google, you aggregate their market shares around the world, whereas otherwise, for other companies, you don't have that. ISPs, for example.
Okay. Google's market share is higher in Europe than in the States. That's
yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Two comments. One is, I think we mix up Google and content creators. They're different. I understand that Google is an advertising engine, but in terms of actually creating news like a network, we need to somehow disaggregate that to make the comparisons useful in terms of the voice to a country. Secondly, the thing missing across all of the presentations, I guess I can say this because I think I'm the oldest person in the room at 72, is it feels terribly like we've assumed the world is television and the world is networks and the world is Sky and voices that we all grew up with. And if you look at the demographics and the use of media, most of it is not. Most of it is young people with 72 hours of video going on YouTube every minute, with whole new networks and voices arising. And if we're going to really talk about where people are getting information and what's coming, it seems to, the networks to me seem very anachronistic, almost old-fashioned in my country. And certainly not the place I go to see politics or policy or culture played out, because the younger generation is larger and they don't go there.
Okay. Okay, I think we have to close to this part, so we leave some issues open. We probably even have to leave out the open idea, United States, San Diego, New York being closer in television than between Paris and some other cities in Europe. I think when talking about simplistic views, we could compare these easily. However, I think there was a very good discussion. I like the idea that we discussed. Of course, we didn't get a solution. We have some disagreements still on the podium. I think we have to resolve in the next week or years or something. So EMA has lots of discussions. I see some discussions here, and this is great. Thank you very much.